If you have something you'd like to share, I know some of you do, now's your chance, and we'll be delighted to hear what you have to say.
I thought I'd kick it off, actually. I wanted to say something, but they wouldn't let me up there on the stage. I was given instructions not to quit the whole day, so I'm not gonna. But I do have some dad-isms here, and these are things that Dad used to say around the house that we all kind of ingrained. And the neat thing about it is, I find myself saying these things at work in different places. Some people don't understand them when I say them. I understand them because I grew up in that family, and my brothers and sisters understand them. But the neat thing about that is every time I say that, it always brings up fond memories of Dad. I think of him. So I'm really glad I have these things. But I'll tell you some of them, and then I'll explain maybe a little bit about it. Or I might explain before I say it. In the case of this first one, Dad had a way of, if we were doing something bad or he wanted us to do something, he wouldn't threaten us mean. He would say something kind of humorous, but we knew that he meant business. And he said, you do this or there'll be guts to clean up. We knew what that meant. Now, I've said that to employees at work. That's not a good thing. They call HR. And I've learned how to swear from Dad. That was one of the things he taught me. And here's the worst of it, okay? This is his 4-letter words here. If something really was bad, he'd say, gosh, all fish hooks. Ever hear that? I never knew what that meant, but that's as bad as it got. Now, mealtime was always an adventure at our house because of so many kids and everybody grabbing for food and stuff. But Dad had a way of, when he was hungry, he wouldn't say, hey, I'm hungry. He said, my big innards is eating up my little innards. So we knew that he was hungry. And then we'd come sit around the table and he'd say, okay, everybody bow your eyes and close your heads. So we knew what that meant. And then after he said amen, he'd say, okay, everybody knock over your glass. Because that's usually what happens. Somebody would always spill their glass because we're all grabbing for food. So he would do that. Dad had a lot of, being a preacher and things, he had a lot of church witticisms, and you had to know what they meant. And does anybody know what if he saw somebody doing something, a certain thing, he'd say, they must be studying the Sunday school lesson. Now what do you suppose that could have been that they were doing? So he saw somebody being lovey-dovey in a car or something like that, he said, oh, they must be studying the Sunday school lesson.
That's good.
The other thing that was always humorous, even though he did it a lot, it was still humorous. We'd be driving along the road, and there'd be a bar over here, and there'd be a bunch of cars over there, and he goes, hey, look at all those cars over there. And then he'd go, must be a revival meeting over there. He'd always follow up with that. Another saying he always did, which is kind of fun for me, but it doesn't make any sense if you say it outside the family. But if somebody was doing something in a hurry, he saw somebody going real fast down the road or whatever, he'd say, "That's it looks like they're bad out of Sunday school."
Bad out of Sunday school.
Always referred back to Sunday school. He must have hated Sunday school or something. It was already mentioned once, he had a lot of names for everybody, but he was constantly forgetting our names, and he would say the wrong name, and then he would always follow that up with, like what Vic said, was George, Bill, Zeke. So we were all George, Bill, and Zeke at one point or other. Then the last thing I'm going to share was something that was a little unusual. He'd usually be telling us a story or something, and I know they talked about telling a story. At some point in there, he would throw in this saying. He'd say, all of a sudden, the flock of jug handles flew over. And everybody kind of stopped and go, what's that mean? He said, I don't know, but Uncle DL used to always throw that into his stories. So I never knew what that meant. Maybe somebody here knows what that means, but that was always coming out in our stories.
That's good.
But, all right.
She taught all of us kids in the neighborhood how to swim. You remember that? I was the same age as Ruth. Ruth was born March 13th, I was born March 25th, the same year. And then Becky was 2 years younger, Tim was 3 years younger. Tim was the best friend of the group because he was the boy. And I remember I had fond memories of staying all night at their house. And I think Dave and Jonathan and Steve were all in college. I remember the bedroom Tim and I would sleep in. There was these airplanes hanging from the ceiling. And I don't know whether Dave or Jonathan made those, but I used to want to play with them. And Tim wouldn't let me because he knew he'd be the one to get in trouble if they were disturbed, because, yeah, it'd be guts to clean up. But Tim and I were real close back then. And one thing about Carl I remember lots of things. He scolded us boys that sat in the front row of Mount Tabor for reading our Sunday school papers, and during church service he scolded us once, and so we never did that afterwards. I remember when I first learned to drive, I was going to go to the junkyard once, and Dad had some steel or iron to take and get some money for it. And Grandpa Binkley called me up, and he knew I was going to the junkyard, and he wanted me to come down and get some things. And he had me in the barn there. He had me take a shovel, dig out this copper wire that was under the mud there to take the junkyard. And I was so annoyed because it had mud on it, and I just didn't want to mess with it. But I must have had like 3 5-gallon buckets full of copper wire. I remember I went to the junkyard. I think I got $2 for the iron, and I got almost $20 for the copper. But I really appreciate he was doing that for me just to see if I would go through with it, because he knew that was worth more than the iron I was taking. It was a wonderful family. Enjoyed them very much. And when I stayed at the Binkley house, I used to get up, and Mrs. Binkley would get up real early in the morning. I think she got up at 4 o'clock or something. She made cinnamon rolls and hot chocolate, and she had this white plastic dishes, I remember, and I just used to love that, the cinnamon rolls and that hot chocolate.
Thank you, Jim. I might mention that the vast majority of in just a moment lived just the next farm down from us, and we all lived on Fast Road.
Yes, I'm Larry Fast. The Binkleys moved to Mount Tabor, I think, when I was about 2nd or 3rd grade. And Reverend Binkley always meant a lot to me because he led me to the Lord. We had a revival service. Orson Welles, I think, was the name from Oklahoma. And I remember that I went forward that night at the revival meeting and accepted Christ. And as I look back on my life, Christ has always been with me since then. And Reverend Binkley has always been a mentor to me. I remember he used to take me around with him in his car when he'd go deliver different church things to the district churches. Couple things that I remember. I remember my little sister Vicki. She used to take marbles to church. And she was a little little girl, and she played the marbles during church service. And we had a hardwood floor in the church. And one time, right in the middle of the sermon, she dropped that whole bag of marbles. They just went rolling all over the floor, and it made such a big noise. And Reverend Binkley had to stop preaching, and finally says, "Somebody lost their marbles." I remember one other thing. Dad used to always hire the Binkley boys to work for him. You remember that, Dave? He used to do that. And one time we had Victor down there working for us. I think Victor was in college at the time. And we noticed that Victor was just eating as fast as he could. We were a little slow and laid back, and he was just eating. So finally Dad says, "Well, Victor, slow down. You don't have to eat that fast." And Vic says, "Hey, we have to eat this fast at home if we're going to get anything to eat."